My stepmom ruthlessly ensured I was left with absolutely nothing when my father passed. She cunningly pulled every string from the shadows. My life with my father, Arthur, had been a tapestry woven with grief and resilience after my mother passed when I was just 12. For 4 years, it was just the two of us, and honestly, despite the sadness, those were some of the best years. Arthur, a brilliant financial advisor, wasn't just my dad, he was my mentor. He taught me about investing, managing money, and the absolute necessity of financial independence. Our Sunday ritual, poring over the stock market section, discussing companies and investments, wasn't just a habit, it was his way of saying, "Son, too many people go through life completely clueless and end up getting screwed. Not you." He was preparing me, though for what, I couldn't have imagined then. When I was 16, Arthur met Brenda at a charity event. She was 42, he was 48. Brenda was a dental hygienist with 2 kids, Sarah, 14, and Luke, 11. Right away, a chill ran down my spine. The Brenda around Arthur was this sweet, caring woman, all about blending families and making everyone happy. But the second he left the room, her whole personality would snap. Her smiles would harden, her eyes would roll when I talked about college, and she'd make snide remarks about my mom's old belongings still being in the house. She treated me like an annoying obstacle to her perfect new life. I tried to tell Arthur, just a few months into their relationship. I laid it all out. He just brushed it off. Adjustment period, son. Give her a chance. He was lonely, I understood that. He wanted companionship. But he was also completely blind to the slow, insidious poisoning happening right under his nose. They got married when I was 17. The wedding was a colossal production Brenda planned entirely around her own desires. The venue, the flowers, the food, all her choices. Arthur just went along with whatever made her happy. I remember standing there in an uncomfortable rental tuxedo, feeling a cold dread, knowing deep down this was a huge mistake. But what could I do? He was an adult making his own choices. After the wedding, things truly deteriorated. Brenda, Sarah, and Luke moved into our home. Suddenly, my close relationship with Arthur became a distant memory. He was constantly needed elsewhere because Brenda, a maestro of manufactured emergencies and drama, demanded his immediate attention. Sarah needs help with homework. Luke has to be driven to practice. The kitchen faucet is leaking. The car's making a weird noise. There was always something pulling Arthur away from our Sunday morning routine, pulling him away from me. Within 6 months, Brenda had convinced Arthur to put both their names on all his accounts. Her reasoning? She needed access to pay bills, handle household expenses since she was now managing the home. It sounded sensible enough on the surface, but it gave her complete visibility and control over Arthur's finances. She knew exactly how much money he had, where it was, and what he was doing with it. I left for college at 18, and it was a strange mix of relief and terror. Relief because I was finally away from Brenda's constant passive-aggressive comments. Terrifying because I knew she'd have Arthur all to herself, free to manipulate him without me there to call out her nonsense. My fears, tragically, were completely justified. Arthur had always planned to pay for my college. He'd been saving in a dedicated education fund since I was born. It was one of those things he was immensely proud of, ensuring I wouldn't have massive student debt. The fund had about $75,000 in it when I started school. First semester went fine. Tuition paid. Books and housing covered. Then, second semester, Arthur called with bad news. He said there had been unexpected expenses with the house and Sarah's car, and he could only cover half my tuition. I'd need to take out loans for the rest. I was utterly confused. I knew the education fund existed specifically for this. He assured me it was temporary, that things would be back to normal next year. They never were. Every semester after that, there was a new excuse. Luke needed braces. The roof needed replacing. Foundation cracks. Brenda's car died, and she needed a new one. Sarah was starting college too, and needed help with expenses. It was always something, and my education fund kept getting raided to cover these so-called emergencies. I ended up taking out $38,000 in student loans to finish my degree. Meanwhile, Sarah went to an expensive private university, magically never taking out a single loan. Luke got a brand new truck for his 16th birthday. Brenda got a luxury SUV. The house got completely renovated with new appliances, flooring, and a deck. But there was never money for my education, apparently. I tried talking to Arthur multiple times. He'd get defensive, say I didn't understand how expensive it was to run a household with a family. He'd remind me that Brenda's kids were his responsibility now, too, and I needed to be more understanding. The man who used to teach me about financial planning and making smart money decisions was suddenly acting like money just disappeared into thin air with no accountability. Looking back, it's sickeningly clear, Brenda was systematically draining my education fund and using the money for her own kids, while making sure my education was paid for by loans I'd have to pay back. She was positioning her children to start their adult lives debt-free, while saddling me with financial burden. And she did it so subtly, making Arthur think he was being a good stepfather and provider for the whole family. I graduated with my accounting degree and got a job at a decent firm, immediately starting to chip away at my loans while living in a small apartment with 2 roommates. Meanwhile, Sarah and Luke were living at home rent-free while going to school, driving nice cars, and generally having everything handed to them on a silver platter. About 2 years after I graduated, Arthur called. His voice was different, tired, distant. He'd been having health issues, doctors running tests. He didn't want me to worry, but thought I should know. Something about his tone made my stomach drop, but I tried to stay positive. He was only 58, always healthy. Surely, it was minor. The tests came back with the diagnosis none of us wanted to hear: pancreatic cancer, stage 3. The prognosis was brutal. Less than a 10% 5-year survival rate. I immediately started making the 3-hour drive home every weekend for appointments, to help however I could. This disease moves fast and hits hard. Watching Arthur go through treatment was agonizing. He lost weight rapidly. The chemo made him constantly nauseous. He'd always been this strong, capable man. Suddenly, he couldn't even get out of bed some days. Brenda played the devoted wife perfectly for the outside world. She'd post on social media about their journey, how they were fighting together. She'd show up to appointments and hold Arthur's hand in the waiting room. Everyone saw her as this amazing woman standing by her husband. But I saw the other side when it was just family. Brenda would complain constantly about how hard this was on her. How she was exhausted from caregiving. How this wasn't what she signed up for when they got married. How her own needs weren't being met because Arthur was always sick or sleeping. She also started talking about money a lot. Cancer treatment was expensive. Arthur had to cut back his hours. They were dipping into savings. Brenda made sure everyone knew how much financial stress she was under, usually right in front of Arthur while he was trying to rest. Around month 4 of treatment, Arthur asked me to come over on a weekday. He said he needed to talk to me about something important that couldn't wait until the weekend. I took a personal day, expecting more bad news about his health. We sat in his home office, which had become his sanctuary during treatment. Brenda rarely went in there, so it was one of the few places he could have privacy. Arthur looked terrible, pale and thin, wearing a knit cap to cover his hair loss. But his eyes were clear, focused, a quiet strength I hadn't seen in months. He told me he'd been doing a lot of thinking about mortality, about what would happen after he was gone. He wanted to make sure I was taken care of, but also knew Brenda would be in a difficult position as a widow. He was trying to balance everyone's needs. Then he said something that stuck with me, a flicker of his old self cutting through the haze. He told me he'd set up some things years ago, before he even got sick, because he believed in being prepared. He said a good financial advisor always had contingency plans, and he'd made sure there were provisions for different scenarios. He told me to trust that he'd thought everything through carefully and that I should remember our Sunday morning lessons about patience and long-term thinking. At the time, I thought he was just being philosophical, maybe a bit out of it from the medications. The conversation felt important, but also vague and confusing. He made me promise not to mention our talk to Brenda, because he didn't want her stressed about financial planning when she was already overwhelmed with caregiving. I agreed, gave him a hug, and drove back to my apartment feeling unsettled. Treatment continued for another 8 months. There were moments of fleeting hope. Tumors would shrink. His energy would improve. Then the cancer would roar back, worse than before. During this time, Brenda became increasingly controlling about Arthur's care and who could visit. She'd schedule things so my visits conflicted with treatments or rest. She'd forget to tell me about appointments. She'd say Arthur got too tired when I visited, even though he always perked up when I was there. Sarah and Luke were around constantly, which was fine, but Brenda made it clear the house belonged to her kids now. They'd taken over the living room with their stuff. Luke had converted the garage into his personal space. Sarah was using Arthur's office sometimes for her grad school work, despite knowing it was his sanctuary. When I mentioned maybe giving Arthur more space and quiet, Brenda acted like I was selfish, uncaring about the whole family's needs. The last 3 months were the hardest. Arthur went on hospice care at home, in a hospital bed in the living room, barely conscious most days. Brenda hired home health aides, which was necessary, but then used it as justification for why I didn't need to visit as often. She'd tell me the aides had everything under control, and Arthur was usually sleeping anyway. I came down every weekend regardless. I'd sit next to his bed and hold his hand, tell him about my work, my life, read him articles from the financial section of the newspaper, just like our Sunday mornings. Sometimes he'd squeeze my hand or give a small smile, letting me know he could hear me. Brenda would hover during these visits, always finding reasons to interrupt. The aides needed to turn him. He needed medications. It was time for his treatment. She'd manufacture urgency to cut my time with him short. Then I'd see Sarah and Luke sitting with him for hours without any interruptions. One weekend, Arthur seemed more alert than he'd been in weeks. Brenda happened to be out running errands with Sarah. It was just me, Arthur, and one of the aides who stepped out to give us privacy. Arthur gestured me closer. His voice was barely a whisper, but he was crystal clear. He told me he was sorry for how things had worked out with college money. He said Brenda had convinced him at the time that combining resources was the right thing to do for the blended family, but he'd realized too late that I'd gotten the short end of the deal. He said he tried to make it right and to remember what we talked about in his office. Then he squeezed my hand and closed his eyes. That was the last real conversation I had with my father. He slipped into unconsciousness 2 days later and passed away 4 days after that. He was 59 years old. The funeral was, predictably, a production. Brenda went all out with the service, the flowers, the reception. She played the devastated widow perfectly. Black dress, tears at all the right moments, gracious acceptance of condolences. People kept telling her how strong she was, how devoted she'd been, what an inspiration. Sarah and Luke stood with her like a united front. I was there, of course, but Brenda had seated me away from the immediate family section. When people asked, she explained that I preferred to grieve privately and requested space. Complete nonsense. But what was I going to do? Make a scene at my father's funeral? The reception was at the house afterward. People approached me with condolences and memories of Arthur. I appreciated it, but all I could think about was getting through the day and going back to my apartment to process everything alone. Brenda worked the room like a politician, ensuring everyone saw her strength and grace under pressure. About a week after the funeral, Arthur's attorney, Marcus Thorne, called me. He said there would be a formal reading of the will in 2 weeks at his office and my presence was required. The way he said it made it clear this wasn't optional. I confirmed I'd be there and started mentally preparing myself for whatever was coming. Those 2 weeks were strange. I had to use bereavement leave from work. I was staying at a hotel near my hometown because there was no way I was staying at Brenda's house. She'd called me a few times to coordinate estate stuff, when to collect any personal items of Arthur's I wanted, the attorney meeting, that kind of thing. Her tone was polite but distant, like I was some business associate rather than her late husband's son. I went to the house once during those 2 weeks to get some of Arthur's things. Brenda had already boxed up most of his belongings and had them waiting in the garage for me. His watch, some photos, his collection of financial books, his old baseball glove. Seeing his whole life reduced to a few boxes was gutting. While I was loading them into my car, Sarah came out. She didn't say much, just made some comment about how hard this must be for all of us. But the whole time, she had this look on her face, like she was trying not to smile. It was subtle, but I caught it. Whatever was about to happen, she already knew and was enjoying my ignorance. The day of the will reading finally arrived. Marcus Thorne's office was downtown, in one of those old buildings that screams, old money, and established families. I showed up 15 minutes early because Arthur always taught me punctuality mattered. Brenda arrived exactly on time with Sarah and Luke. She was dressed in an expensive black pantsuit, looking every bit the successful widow. Sarah wore pearls. Luke had on a suit that probably cost more than my rent. Thorne, maybe 60, gray hair, expensive suit, the kind of lawyer who'd been handling wealthy families' estates for decades, welcomed us into his conference room. He had folders laid out on the table with our names on them. We all sat down. Brenda had positioned herself at the head of the table with Sarah and Luke on either side. I sat across from them, which felt appropriate given how this family dynamic had always worked. Thorne sat at the other end and opened his folder. He started with the standard formalities, this being the last will and testament of Arthur, confirming he was of sound mind when he created it. Then he got into the actual distribution of assets. The house went to Brenda entirely. No surprise there, they'd owned it jointly. Its value was estimated at $420,000, fully paid off. Thorne explained this would be hers outright with no restrictions. Arthur's retirement accounts, totaling about $380,000, also went to Brenda as the named beneficiary. Again, standard for a spouse. His life insurance policy paid out $500,000 to Brenda. She'd been the beneficiary on that, too. Then Thorne got to the investment accounts. This is where things got interesting. Arthur's main brokerage account had about $240,000. The will specified that account would be split evenly between Sarah and Luke. So, they each got $120,000. For college graduates with no debt who'd been handed everything their whole lives, this was basically bonus money to start their adult lives even further ahead. I sat there doing the math in my head. Brenda had just inherited over $1.3 million in assets between the house, retirement accounts, and life insurance. Sarah and Luke were each getting $120,000. That was $1,540,000 total going to Brenda's side of the family. Then Thorne got to my part. There was a small account with about $15,000 that I'd received. He explained this was from an old savings account Arthur had maintained. That was it. $15,000. I could feel Brenda and her kids trying not to react. The smugness was radiating off them. They had successfully maneuvered to get virtually everything while I got what amounted to a token amount. Years of manipulation, of positioning themselves as the real family, while pushing me to the outside, had paid off exactly how Brenda planned. But Thorne wasn't finished. He pulled out another folder, this one separate from the will documents. He looked directly at me and said there was an additional matter to address that wasn't part of the will, but was relevant to the estate. He explained that 8 years ago, shortly before Arthur married Brenda, Arthur had established a separate investment account at a different brokerage firm. This account was set up as a transfer on death (TOD) account, with me as the sole beneficiary. It was never mentioned in the will because it didn't need to be. TOD accounts bypass probate entirely and transfer directly to the named beneficiary. The room got very quiet. I could see Brenda's expression starting to change from smug satisfaction to confused concern. Thorne continued. He said Arthur had funded this account with $50,000 initially and had continued making contributions to it over the years. The account had been invested in a diversified portfolio of index funds and had grown substantially over time. Arthur had made it very clear in his instructions that this account was never to be mentioned to anyone until after his death and that I was to be informed of its existence at the reading. Brenda's face was going white. Sarah and Luke had stopped looking smug and now looked confused and worried. Thorne opened the folder and read the current balance of the account. $673,000. The silence in that room was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop. Brenda's mouth literally fell open. Sarah gasped. Luke looked like he'd been slapped. I sat there stunned, trying to process what I just heard. $673,000 in an account only I knew about, that Arthur had set up years before he even got sick. Back when I was still in high school. Thorne kept talking, explaining the account details, but I was barely hearing him. My mind was reeling, connecting the dots. That conversation in Arthur's office, him telling me he'd set up things years ago, that I should remember our Sunday morning lessons about patience and long-term thinking. He'd been telling me about this account, in his own quiet way. He'd set this up before Brenda could get her hands on it, before she could manipulate the finances, before she could position her kids ahead of me. He'd protected my inheritance years in advance, probably because he suspected exactly what kind of person Brenda really was, even if he wouldn't admit it out loud. Brenda found her voice first. It came out shaky and angry at the same time. She demanded to know how this was possible. Arthur had promised her they shared everything. They'd discussed his finances many times. He'd never mentioned another account. This had to be some kind of mistake or fraud. Thorne calmly explained that the account was entirely legitimate. He had all the documentation. Arthur had every right to maintain separate accounts and name whoever he wanted as beneficiaries. The account had been properly reported on tax returns every year. Everything was legal and above board. Brenda's face crumbled into pure rage. She started saying this wasn't fair, that Arthur had promised to take care of her, that she'd given up years of her life being his caregiver, that she deserved more for everything she'd sacrificed. I finally spoke up. I kept my voice calm and level, just like Arthur taught me. I pointed out that she just inherited over $1 million in assets. She owned a $400,000 house free and clear. Her kids each got 6 figures. She was going to be fine financially. But what really needed to be said was this: Arthur had set up that account 8 years ago, right after they got married, because even back then, he was protecting my future. He'd watched over the years as his education fund for me got drained to pay for Sarah's private school and Luke's new truck and Brenda's luxury SUV. He'd seen how I ended up with student debt while her kids got everything handed to them. And he'd made sure that in the end, things would balance out. Brenda started crying, but they weren't real tears. They were angry, frustrated tears of someone who'd been outplayed and knew it. She'd spent years manipulating finances and positioning herself and her kids to inherit everything. And Arthur had quietly undermined the whole scheme with one account she never knew existed. Sarah tried saying something about how we were all family and this money should be shared among everyone. The hypocrisy was stunning. Where was that family unity talk when I was taking out student loans while she went to private school debt-free? Where was sharing when Luke got a new truck and I was driving a 15-year-old sedan? I told them the meeting was over as far as I was concerned. Thorne confirmed he'd handle all the transfer paperwork for the TOD account and would be in touch with me directly. I stood up, shook his hand, and walked out of that conference room without looking back at Brenda or her kids. I could hear Brenda yelling behind me as I left. Something about how this wasn't over and she'd contest this, and Arthur wasn't in his right mind. Thorne's calm voice responded that Arthur had been completely competent when he set up the account, and there were no grounds for any challenge. The account was mine legally, and there was nothing she could do about it. I drove straight back to my apartment, a 3-hour journey I barely remember. My mind was spinning with everything that had just happened. When I got home, I just sat on my couch staring at the wall for probably an hour, trying to process it all. Arthur had protected me. Even while sick, even while Brenda was manipulating him and draining resources to benefit her kids. Somewhere in his mind, he'd held on to that account as my safety net. He'd remembered our Sunday morning lessons about long-term planning and patience. He'd trusted that I'd understand when the time came. The $15,000 from the will was the obvious inheritance that Brenda knew about and accepted because it was a pittance compared to what she was getting. She'd probably orchestrated things to make sure that's all I got from the will itself. But the $673,000 from the TOD account? That was Arthur's real gift to me. That was him making sure I'd be okay, making up for the education fund that got raided, balancing the scales after years of Brenda's manipulation. Over the next few days, I got multiple calls and texts from Brenda. First, she tried guilt. I was betraying Arthur's memory by not sharing with the family. Then she tried logic. The money should be divided equally among all the children. Then she went to threats. She'd hire lawyers. She'd fight this. I'd regret being so selfish. I blocked her number after the 5th call. Thorne had already confirmed the account was ironclad. There was nothing Brenda could do legally to touch it. Sarah sent me a long text about how disappointed she was in me, how I was tearing apart the family over money, how Arthur would be ashamed of my greed. The message was so ridiculous, I actually laughed. This coming from someone who'd benefited from my education fund money and never said a word about fairness. Then Luke's message was shorter but similar, calling me selfish and saying I should think about what Arthur would want. What Arthur wanted was pretty clear. He wanted me to have that account, which is why he set it up with my name on it 8 years ago. I didn't respond to any of them. There was no point. They weren't interested in actual conversation or understanding. They were just pissed that their gravy train had hit an unexpected obstacle named Arthur's actual son. The account transfer took about 3 weeks to finalize. Thorne handled everything professionally and kept me updated on the progress. When the money finally hit my account, seeing that balance was surreal. I'd gone from having about $18,000 in savings and $31,000 in remaining student debt to having over $690,000 liquid. First thing I did was pay off my student loans completely. $31,000 gone in one payment. The weight that lifted off my shoulders was incredible. Arthur had wanted me to start my adult life without that burden, and Brenda had made sure I carried it instead. Now it was finally gone. Next, I paid off my car loan. Then I looked at my budget and realized I could actually afford to buy a place instead of renting. Something Arthur always said was that real estate was one of the best long-term investments if you bought smart and didn't overextend. I spent about 2 months looking at properties, found a solid townhouse in a good neighborhood for $270,000. Put down 20%, got a great mortgage rate, moved in a month later. Suddenly, I was a homeowner at 29 with a small mortgage payment and no other debt. I kept the rest of the money invested in the same index funds Arthur had chosen. He'd built that portfolio carefully, and the returns had been steady for 8 years. No reason to mess with a strategy that worked. About 6 months after Arthur died, I got a message from a number I didn't recognize. It was Luke. He'd gotten a new phone and wanted to reach out because he'd been doing some thinking. He said he realized the money situation was complicated and maybe everyone had overreacted. He wanted to grab coffee and talk things through. I was skeptical, but a part of me wondered if maybe he'd actually grown up a bit and was trying to make amends. So, I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop near my new place. Luke showed up looking rough. He'd gained weight, had dark circles under his eyes, and generally looked stressed. His clothes were wrinkled, and his usual confident swagger was completely gone. We did the awkward small talk for a few minutes, weather, traffic, how's work going, before he got to the real reason he'd called. Turns out Brenda had blown through a lot of the inheritance already. She'd bought a new luxury car immediately after getting the life insurance money. Some ridiculous SUV that cost $90,000 because she deserved it after being a caregiver. Then she'd taken Sarah on an expensive vacation to Italy for 3 weeks because Sarah was stressed from grad school, apparently, and needed to decompress in a 5-star resort. She'd done major renovations to the house that weren't necessary, ripping out perfectly good kitchens and bathrooms just because she wanted a fresh start. She'd made some bad investment decisions based on tips from friends that lost money. Now, 6 months later, she was worried about finances. The retirement account she'd inherited had some restrictions on how much she could withdraw without penalties. The house was paid off, but still had property taxes and maintenance costs. She'd quit her job as a dental hygienist right after Arthur died because she didn't need to work anymore. But her spending was outpacing her actual available income by a lot. Luke's new truck had needed major repairs after he'd wrecked it. Insurance didn't cover everything, and suddenly his portion of inheritance was looking a lot smaller than he'd anticipated. Sarah had burned through a chunk of her money already and was asking Brenda for more. The family needed help, Luke said. They needed me to step up and contribute. After all, we were still family. Arthur would want us to support each other. I let him finish his whole pitch. Then I asked him one simple question: where was this family unity when I was taking out student loans while you got a new truck? He tried to deflect. That was different. That was before. Things have changed now. I told him, things have changed indeed. I'd learned exactly what kind of family Brenda had built. One where her kids got everything and I got scraps. One where manipulation and selfishness were rewarded while actual hard work and responsibility were punished. Arthur had seen it too, which is why he protected my inheritance from Brenda's schemes. Luke got angry, then said I was being unreasonable, that I had way more money than I needed while they were struggling. That family helps family. The entitlement was stunning. He genuinely believed I owed them some of my inheritance because they'd mismanaged theirs. I stood up and told him the meeting was over. I said I had no interest in funding their lifestyle or bailing them out of poor financial decisions. They'd gotten over $1 million from Arthur's estate, and that was their share. What I got was mine. Set up specifically for me years before any of them were even in Arthur's life. He called me some names as I walked out. Said I was, just like my mother, cold and selfish. That one actually made me laugh because he'd never even met my mother. She died before Brenda came into the picture. He was just throwing out insults to see what would stick. I blocked his new number and went back to my life. The next few months were peaceful. I settled into my townhouse, continued working, made some improvements to the property. I opened a separate investment account and continued following Arthur's strategy of regular contributions to index funds. The holidays rolled around and I got a text from Thorne. Brenda had tried to contest the TOD account again, claiming Arthur wasn't mentally competent due to his cancer treatments. She'd apparently spent a lot of money on lawyers to pursue this claim. Thorne said it went nowhere. The account had been established 7 years before Arthur got sick, and there was extensive documentation of his competency throughout that time. The judge threw out her case in about 15 minutes, and Brenda was on the hook for legal fees on both sides. Another expensive lesson in how you can't manipulate your way out of legal documents. I found out later through mutual family friends that Brenda ended up selling the house. The combination of property taxes, maintenance costs, and her expensive lifestyle made it unsustainable without steady income. She bought a smaller condo and went back to work part-time as a dental hygienist. Sarah had to drop out of grad school because she couldn't afford it anymore. Luke was living with Brenda and working retail. The whole empire Brenda had built on Arthur's money was crumbling because none of them knew how to actually manage finances or live within their means. Meanwhile, I got a promotion at work. Started seeing someone who actually appreciates me and doesn't come with drama. My townhouse is great. My investments are growing steadily. I'm on track to retire comfortably. Arthur's lessons about long-term thinking and patience are paying off exactly like he said they would during those Sunday morning sessions. Sometimes I think about what might have happened if Arthur hadn't set up that account. If Brenda's plan had worked and I'd gotten just the $15,000 while her kids got everything else, I probably would have struggled for years with debt, might never have bought a home. Might have stayed stuck in that cycle of feeling like the black sheep who got nothing while everyone else prospered. But Arthur knew. Even in those early days of his marriage to Brenda, when he was lonely and wanted companionship, some part of him recognized what she really was. He saw how she treated me when he wasn't looking. He noticed how resources got directed to her kids while I got excuses. And he made sure that in the end, his son would be taken care of. The last conversation we had when he was barely conscious makes so much sense now. He apologized for the college money because he knew Brenda had manipulated that situation. He told me to remember our office talk because that's when he'd hinted at the account. He'd done everything he could within the constraints of his marriage to protect me, and it worked. I visited Arthur's grave last week. First time I'd been there since the funeral. Brought some flowers and just sat there for a while talking to him like we used to on Sunday mornings. I told him about the townhouse, the promotion, how I'd invested the money the way he taught me. I also told him I understood now. The TOD account wasn't just about money. It was about him making sure I knew I mattered. That despite Brenda's years of manipulation and favoritism toward her own kids, he'd never forgotten I was his son. That he'd planned for my future and protected it from the people who would have taken it if given the chance. Brenda tried one more time to contact me a few months ago. She sent a letter to my work address somehow, asking if we could put the past behind us and rebuild a relationship. She talked about how Arthur would want his family to stay together and how holding grudges wasn't healthy. I read the letter then threw it away. There was no family to rebuild because there never really was one. There was Brenda's family, her, Sarah, and Luke, who benefited from Arthur's money while treating me like an outsider. And there was me, Arthur's actual son, who he made sure to protect from their schemes. It makes me wonder about the quiet battles people fight, the hidden wisdom parents pass on. Have you ever seen someone like Brenda get their comeuppance? What's the most surprising hidden truth you've ever uncovered? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below.